So going back to as far as you can remember, what inspired you to go down the path of being in the military and a life of service?
Well, both my wife and I are Army brats. We grew up in Army families. We lived all over the world, in Europe and Panama. Uh, I think from the start there was just a sense on my part. I went to high school in Paris, France. My wife went to high school in Berlin. So we both felt comfortable in a life of military service, which is what we did for essentially for 33 years.
Wow. Was it that your parents were military? Did you get it from your father, your grandfather? Is it just?
Well, sure. We were both in military families. Both dads were West Pointers. Both fought in World War II. My wife's dad was in the 11th Airborne in the Pacific Theater. My dad fought in Italy. All my uncles were in the armed forces. And by the way, to some extent it continues. My daughter was an ICU nurse down here at Madigan Army Hospital at Fort Lewis. My son served 25 years as an infantry officer, combat in Iraq, Afghanistan. So there's been a family tradition of commitment. By the way, 2 grandsons are now in the Air Force. One in the Washington Air National Guard, and the other one Air Force Academy grad in Grand Forks, North Dakota.
Carrying on the tradition. Mm-hmm. So when they think of you and your life of service, you served 2 combat tours in Vietnam. You were wounded 3 times. Mm-hmm. Those experiences, how did that change you?
Well, early on, I graduated into an army that had been at peace essentially since the Korean War, and there would never be another war. I always caution young soldiers and service members about this notion that we've seen the end of war. Of course it isn't. There's permanent national security interests of the United States that are always being threatened by some foreign power. But so I graduated, and immediately we were wrapped up. The first deployment actually was peacekeeping in the 82nd Airborne into the Dominican Republic. And that was followed by 2 combat tours in Vietnam, and then a division commander in the Gulf War Desert Storm. So when you put on the uniform of the country in any of the service branches, you accept the possibility that at midnight you get the call and you deploy to parts unknown for an unknown period of time where your life may be at risk. There are fortunately still 2.1 million young men and women who felt that call in the active Guard and Reserve components.
What was it like serving 2 tours in Vietnam? When we think about Vietnam, it feels so distant. Mm-hmm. But you were wounded twice. Mm-hmm. So that experience had to do something in terms of molding how you moved forward in the military.
Yeah. Well, I was actually wounded 3 times, to be honest. And I think a lot of young soldiers, certainly my generation, reading the tales of World War II and the victorious outcome, and so we were predisposed to want to serve and to be at the pointy end of the spear. But it's quickly apparent to people who serve in combat, you're crawling around the mud with a sack full of hand grenades, shooting it out with somebody 20 feet away, that this is not a glamorous life. We lived like animals. We dug like moles. We suffered significant casualties. We were constantly alert day and night. And by the way, we never lost a fight. I was a company commander in the 1st Cavalry Division, 68, 69, probably had 30 engagements. We never lost. So we were really good at what we did. We had, thank God, the power of the U.S. Air Force behind us, and naval air and marine air and U.S. artillery. But it's a rough life, and the people that want to step forward and do that are a special brand of, used to be band of brothers, and now we have women in the infantry as enlisted soldiers as well as officers.
You have received 2 Distinguished Service Crosses, 2 Silver Stars for Valor. Can you share any of the stories behind any of those citations and what they meant to you?
I had a congressman ask me that once. It's always slightly embarrassing to respond to that kind of a question because, in a firefight, the 18-year-old private's in the same gunfire that the captain, company commander is. And, and I tell people, as a company commander in Vietnam in 1968, there was a high probability that you'd be killed or wounded while serving. There were 58,000 killed, 303,000 wounded, 75,000 seriously maimed. So the casualties in the ground combat arms were substantial. I also tell people from then on, whenever I was promoted to a grade, I would say you are dealing with, I'm grateful to be promoted to rank of 2-star general, but my mindset is that of an infantry company commander. So I try and remember what it's like in the dark and the rain and the freezing sleet and under gunfire and artillery fire, what these orders mean when you give them.
And so a lot of what you went through as a young soldier, young officer, molded the type of leader you became.
Oh, no question. It's all very, very easy to move figures on a map and to give grand orders. But at some point, it boils down to 120 soldiers in the dark, cold, hungry, somewhat confused, and threatened by lethal gunfire in the next few minutes. So we're pretty good at it, and we know how to build combined armed teams. And we spend a lot of energy creating our leadership structure, the non-commissioned officers, the sergeants that actually make squads work. And of course, all these services have a different culture, the Air Force, the Navy, and the Army. They share one common objective, that they're trying to be effective at what they do. Mostly, we don't want to fight. We want to deter foreign actors from threatening our national security. But if we do have to fight, it gets to be very deadly serious business.
How would you describe yourself as a leader?
Well, eat last, get on the first helicopter into combat, be an expert at your business, know what you're doing. The primary reason soldiers will follow orders is they say, well, we haven't known her very long, but we've seen her in action. She's got the right credentials. She obviously knows what she's doing. That's the secret to leadership effectiveness. And I think it helps to have spent a career building that understanding, so that when you're a division commander and you have 1,600 armored vehicles, as I did in the attack into Iraq, and 23,000 soldiers, it isn't a gray mass out there. You can see the elements of it, and you know how they work.
Is there any characteristic that's unique to you that makes you exceptional at being a leader?
At the end of the Gulf War, this unbelievable success, we attacked, and essentially with 30 days of an air campaign and 5 days of ground campaign, we defeated what was at one point considered the second largest army in the face of the earth, the Iraqi Armed Forces, giant air force. So that campaign was over, and 2 New York Times reporters were making much of me and talking about, that I was the Patton of the Gulf War. And I said, look, I could have been replaced. If I had a heart attack the day before that attack started, there were a dozen people with my skill set who would have been happy to hear of my demise and would have stepped into command and done the same thing. So, there's a lot of stuff I know how to do, but the armed forces are a giant training machine. So they take some 21-year-old girl graduated from UW and turn her into eventually a lieutenant colonel that knows how to command a air defense battalion. So training, experience, all counts.
I think this is what you were talking about. During Operation Desert Storm, you led the 24th Infantry in the famous left hook maneuver. So for people who don't know what the left hook maneuver is and how significant that was in the Gulf War, walk us through that. Cliff Notes version.
Yeah. Well, we ended up with 500,000 Allied forces, to include Egyptians and Jordanians and Saudis on our side. And we attacked one of the largest militaries in the world, the Iraqis. They were like tethered goats waiting for us to fall on them. They had no idea what we were capable of. We had trained a military, a joint force that was capable, we thought, of defeating the Soviet armed forces in Central Europe. And we put them in the desert with no tree cover. And we put the biggest air component command in the history of warfare into the air. And then my division had a unique responsibility. It was the left hook. So we attacked a couple of 300 miles into Iraq unopposed, got into the Euphrates River Valley, and then turned right and headed for Kuwait. If a division had appeared in the middle of Moscow during a parade, they could not have been more surprised. So it brought the war to an end with minimal loss of life on the Iraqi part. They suffered devastating losses, primarily air power. They did fight. They do have courage, but they just could not deal with the incredible firepower and coordination of the U.S. Armed Forces.
Was that your idea, the left hook?
No, it was General Norman Schwarzkopf. With his genius IQ and his volatile personality, we were all slightly afraid of him.
He had a huge personality during the Gulf War.
Oh, yeah, no question. But he was also brilliant, and he did what, many people describe the U.S. Armed Forces as an industrial machine, not as a fencing outfit. But Schwarzkopf didn't just confront a ground force head on. He did essentially reduce it to ineffectiveness, and then we attacked by indirection. So we're all thankful for his leadership, and the part that we played in carrying it out were important, but he was the guiding light.
What lessons did you learn from working with him, from your time in leadership in the military, that you think are really relevant today?
Don't go to war unless you have to. You have no idea of the potential outcomes. You pick the military option. Now, you may have to. The president said we ought to free Kuwait. It was the right thing to do. But as it turned out, there's never been in Desert Storm a more successful combat campaign that resulted in less political wins. We just didn't exploit the end of war in the first Gulf War. So Saddam Hussein stayed in power. He was an evil impact on the poor Iraqis, particularly the Shia population. So it didn't come out the right way. So if you're going to go to war, understand what are your goals, define them. Go tell the American people. We did that in Desert Storm. The president and the chairman of JCS, General Powell, and Schwarzkopf communicated what we were going to do in Iraq. Then we did it. There was no political exploitation of what we did. So to some extent, the mess in the Middle East is a product not of our making. It's of the Shia-Sunni divide. It's of oil haves and have-nots. There's a lot of reasons for it. But you just got to understand when you pick up the cudgel and take military action, you're taking a high-risk move.
Did we learn from that when you look at what's happening today?
Maybe not. I think, I have some strong views on Iraq and Afghanistan, the endless war that then occurred. When you substitute political objectives that are not achievable by military power, and that means creating a democracy, a rule of law, rights of women to equal place in the market, when you try and do all that, as we did in Afghanistan, and into what was essentially a broken society. It was a culture that had been consumed by 20 years of warfare, civil warfare, Russian warfare. You get in a position where you can't achieve your outcome in less than multiple generations. And by the way, we have done that. The Germans and the Japanese at the end of World War II, in a fairly short order, in 20, 30 years, turned out to be advanced democracies and advanced economic powers. That may have been what we could have accomplished in Afghanistan if we told the American people we're going to be there for 30 years and here's what we're trying to do.
Your career has required long deployments, a lot of time away from home, so many sacrifices. What were the biggest sacrifices that you have made, and how have you coped with that, with your family, with your more than 60 years of marriage to your wife? How have you done it?
Well, to be honest, every time there's a change of command, the outgoing commander has to stand up there, the battalion commander, company commander, and explain how he viewed his command time. And many of them will mention the sacrifices of command, and I certainly don't feel that way. I was thrilled by the opportunity to be a battalion, brigade, division commander, a theater commander. My wife was too. We're both Army brats. We grew up in the military. So I didn't think it was a sacrifice. Now, that is not to say that I thought it was all that much fun sleeping on the side of a ridge and falling snow in Germany on training, and I certainly was keenly aware of the high probability that I'd get killed or maimed in combat. And of course, I felt that even more so for the soldiers under my command. Going into the Gulf War, I used to tell people that I led from the front in that operation, by the way. I was in an armored vehicle right with the attacking battalions. But my concern was, would we suffer grievous losses? I thought we'd have 2,000 killed and wounded, light casualties in a 20,000 plus man division, soldier division, 1,000 women, my division in the Gulf War. And it turned out we had 8 killed and 36 wounded. So it was simply an incredible, favorable outcome. But at the same time, I never lose sight of the fact that it was a disaster for the Iraqi civilians caught in the way of these attacks in the subsequent civil war. So armed conflict has its enormous personal dangers, and along with the commander's inability to guarantee that you can keep these kids alive under his command.
On a personal level, with the years and years that you served, we hear so much about post-traumatic stress. Is that something that you have ever dealt with? And if so, how have you dealt with it? Or what are your thoughts about it?
Well, it's a difficult topic. I think it's been grossly overstated. We sometimes see a third of the returning troops who were in non-combat roles suffering PTSD. Certainly anyone deployed from home, away from family, subject to enemy fire, subject to periods of exhaustion, and particularly if there's an alcohol or drug problem, that will guarantee that you end up with follow-on mental health problems. It's also the case, I was a company commander on my 3rd combat tour, and I had a giant twitch in my face, and I had trouble sleeping, and my radio operator, who I'm still in contact with, would have to slap me in the head if I started talking too loud at night. So there's no question that on anyone, even with people who had such training as I did, with training helps deal with mental health problems. So it's real, but it's most soldiers come back from combat stronger than when they went. But there is a recovery time. You need hot showers, the safety of home, loving families, your associates are around you again, and that will reduce the incident. But PTSD is real. I don't want us to let it become the sort of the hallmark that you're damaged if you go into combat. Not true.
And I guess I was thinking too, you had a family while you were in the military, and your wife was really managing things on the home front here, literally, and that has to have its own challenges, but you were able to do that.
Yeah, and by the way, in the modern time, my son deployed to combat 3 times, and modern military forces call home, call their mother, call their wife. I've seen a staff sergeant in Afghanistan coaching his son in Italy, 173rd Airborne Brigade, on Thursday night math homework. So I think that adds to the stress on military families. In my case, on early combat deployments, Jill raised a family on her own. She would marshal them up and leave quarters and fly home to her mother in Southern California, and did a great job. But it's tough on military families in these periods of conflict. Of course, the toughest part is the concern that your spouse will come home in a box or badly maimed, and that's clearly on the table in warfare.
You established the first Human Rights Council and Code of Conduct for U.S. Joint Command. Why was that important to you?
Well, I was a U.S. Southern Command Commander-in-Chief, dealing with Latin America, Central America, the Caribbean parts. It was not really combat focus. It was dealing with foreign militaries, helping develop them, trying to, I was one of the first people that regained contact in Chile with Pinochet, who was the dictator of Chile. And so we were trying to influence events positively. They do have national security concerns, whether they're internal or external. They do need military forces, naval forces, air power, helicopters, etc. But they also needed to understand the rule of law. And so we'd encourage them, if you want to be, have your place in the world, then your Minister of Defense shouldn't be a general. It ought to be a civilian. We want to see civilian political control of the armed forces. And you simply cannot be used as an internal force of suppression. Argentina, Chile, Brazil, all the Central American countries, their military were greater threats to their own citizens than anybody else. So it was important. That was one of the outcomes that we were trying to achieve in Latin America.
You spent some time in Washington, D.C. working for presidents. What was your contribution? What was your takeaway?
Well, I did. The first time I got pulled out of graduate school as a 25-year-old captain and took part in advising the Chief Staff of the Army on how to create a volunteer army. So we had a lot of dealings with political authorities on how to back away from the draft, which we did with tremendous success, I might add. But I also worked closely with President Bush 41. I was in President Clinton's cabinet as a drug policy director. I had a lot of contact with the younger President Bush and some contact with, considerable contact with the White House during the Obama era. So, I was a professor in national security studies. I had a graduate degree in political science. It was fascinating to me to watch our government. It is completely chaotic. It is ill-formed. It is checks and balances. It's the most effective government on the face of the earth. I've seen most of them at close range. And so we have a hard time making decisions, but normally the outcome is protecting freedom, protecting human rights, protecting opportunity.
And you also worked on national drug policy.
I sure did, yep.
Tell us what you did specifically that was a change maker really for our country.
Well, when President Clinton came into office, the drug problem had been peaking. It became a partisan issue between the Republicans who were in control of Congress and Democratic president. The drug policy coordinator, the drug czar, quit in the middle of the night. He was so disgusted with the inattention he got from Congress and the White House. And they grabbed me as a war hero, as a political choice to get, the election was coming up in a year. And that was probably one of the top 3 reasons Clinton was not going to be reelected. So, they gave me a big pitch. I said, no, I didn't want to do it. I told my dad, a retired 3-star general, he said, shut up and do what the president asks you to do. So that's how I became the drug policy director. It was one of the most absorbing 5.5 years of my life. I have enormous admiration for President Clinton as a brilliant man who cared about children and single mothers. And I mean, if you gave the guy a lie detector test at the end of each day, that's what he thought he was trying to do. So he was, and by the way, the Clinton administration, the economy was good. We didn't get any stupid wars. He loved dealing with people. They had this terrible blot with the whole issue of Monica and crew.
Not a good moment.
But he was just a marvelous man. And we actually got cooperation out of the Republicans, too. And I wasn't seen as a non-political figure, which I was, loyal to the president, but trying to achieve something. We had tremendous impact. We increased investment in research and development dramatically. We got a lot of drug treatment programs funded and organized, and we, most importantly, worked on drug prevention messages. And the message was, Mom and Dad, if you want to fight a war on drugs, start with your own kitchen table and try talking to your kids. And the same with pediatricians and coaches and ministers. Give a message to adolescents in particular that you've got to get through to age 21 without being wrapped up in alcohol abuse or illegal drugs. And if you can get into your early 20s drug-free, the chances are you're never going to be one of the millions, 10 or 12 million Americans whose lives are consumed and impaired by chronic addiction. So that was the message.
You talk about partisanship during your time there. Things have changed dramatically in Washington, D.C. since you were there, haven't they?
Oh, it's really shameful. It's like nothing in the world that we've seen since 1860, the lead up to the Civil War. There's never been such levels of rancor that now most of this, I must admit, and this is my personal view, I think President Trump, who has some messages that resonate with the American people, strong borders, bring back manufacturing, support for the police, he's got some good messages, but he's a lawless fellow. Governing outside democratic norms and sometimes in direct violation of the Constitution. And he's pulling it off, and he's a performer. And the Republicans in Congress have fallen in behind him almost universally. And the Democrats are ineffectual in their response to this. So almost nothing gets done that doesn't immediately turn into a bitter partisan divide. And no one steps away from the party. Currently, Congressman Massey stepped up to oppose rule of law on intervention in Iraq. And Trump promptly says, I'm going to primary you. We got to get this bum out of office. So a lot of these things aren't working. The Constitution, our Constitution, which I've spent years as a professor talking about, is the shortest, oldest governing document in the world. But it only works when all of us agree to the myth of these constitutional values. We got to agree that Article 1 deals with Congress, so that's the source of ultimate power. That means the budget, confirmation of senior officers of government, acknowledging agencies as existing. That seems to have disappeared. And we thought the president has to have constrained authority. He has to respond to judicial intervention. That's at question. So I think we're in trouble.
How serious of trouble are we in? Because, never in my life have I heard so much talk about the Constitution and violations of the Constitution or disregard for the Constitution, ever.
Well, it all boils down to a lack of commitment to American values. And I personally believe that if not checked by the media, the American voters, the Congress, the court system, that Mr. Trump will proceed to autocratic rule by decree. That's clearly where he's headed. He's not even joking when he says, I'm considering a third term in office. His ability to weaponize federal law enforcement to target his political enemies. I think the Supreme Court made a disastrous judgment when they basically said a president may not be prosecuted after removal from office for acts that were part of his job as a president. I think Trump feels no constraints legal on his behavior. I think we're in trouble. We're starting to see some serious opposition. But we've got, Mr. Kennedy Jr. Running against the rule of science in our medical system. It's appalling. We're seeing federal law enforcement brutality and unilateral action, and people getting arrested with their faces covered and no badge showing, and whisked off to unknown places. And by the way, we're seeing stupidity that's being unconstrained. We got 10 or 12 million illegal migrants in this country. The majority of them are desperate economic survivors. They're working, they're paying taxes, Social Security, they've been here for decades. The notion that we would remove them, be able to remove them, is nonsensical. But what we can do is terrorize them and watch the collapse of our agricultural system, construction, service industry. It's simply outrageous. Who is going to speak up in opposition to that? We don't want criminals here, obviously, from foreign countries. We do want to control our borders. We do want immigration reform. We've got none of it. We've got what looks like 1930s Germany with federal law enforcement.
Is there one thing that keeps you up at night more than any other thing?
The rule of law and democracy. I think it's in some peril. I didn't feel that way. Most of the elections in my lifetime, Republican, Democrat, I thought I could live with either party's outcome. Even slightly goofy contenders, as long as they agreed that the Constitution was binding and agreed that states' rights existed and agreed to a limited power and authority of the executive branch. But I think those things are temporarily off the table. If we lose our democracy, we won't get the current situation, by the way, I don't think we'll recover from this for 10 years or more. This isn't a one and gone. You've got these brilliant people like Vice President Vance, articulate, knowledgeable Yale graduate. He espouses the same principles that Trump does. So we got a problem. And my message has always been, get out there and vote, understand who the candidates are, vote for either party, but only vote for people of character. And if we don't, we're going to lose our democracy.
And as somebody who has children and grandchildren and now a great-grandchild, you have reason to be concerned about what kind of world we're going to leave them.
Sure, yeah, no question. And so far it's a good world, by the way. At the end of the day, it's still the most powerful economy on the face of the earth. It has unassailable armed forces, 2.1 million men and women in uniform, active guard reserve. It's a font of scientific and inventive, creative spirit. The country works pretty well at local level. So the problem increasingly has been the national government. It's bitter, deep political divide and a lack of commitment on the rule of law by Trump and much of the MAGA movement.
People do now know you as somebody who is on the network, who's giving them the news, who's giving them analysis of what's happening. And I'm curious how you balance that with your own personal views and make it not political, but give them the information as you see it.
Well, look, growing up in the Army in particular, in command of things, the most prized attribute of an Army officer, of a military officer, is objectivity. It's not argument, it's understanding the facts, of being an expert at what you do. So I find it fairly easy for me in terms of dealing with policy issues to try and understand what's at stake and support policy outcomes that are beneficial to the American people. You've got to be objective. And part of our problem right now is there is no objectivity. It's bitter, instant tribal behavior on the part of both sides. You can't oppose border control if you're a Democrat. It doesn't make any sense. We got to control our own sovereignty. We can't exist without 10 million Latinos who work in this country and are honorable people. You got to be objective about these issues. So I think that's what I try and do when I'm on air, just like King 5 TV.
When you look back over your career, what do you consider your most significant contribution?
When I take on a responsibility, I try and leave it better off than where I found it. The most enduring contacts I've had in my life in the military were the company I commanded, my third combat tour in Vietnam, B Company, 2nd to 7th Cav. We've been having meetings every year for 50 years. I just went to the Memorial Day Vietnam Veterans Memorial Wall as the keynote speaker, and they rallied with their families and grandchildren. We visited the First Sergeant's grave in Arlington. So I think my ability to have participated in keeping the country safe are the most important things I've done. I feel the same way about my drug policy director period. I thought I was helping keep the country safe. So my wife and I, though, our enduring legacy is 3 children and 6 grandchildren who are people of character. That's our gift.
And what advice would you have for men and women considering a career in the military today?
You know, I used to give it, all three of my kids were ROTC students at UW. Two of them got commissioned. My daughter's an ICU nurse, 12 years in the Army. My son, 26 years in the Army. And I used to tell people that I give a pitch on ROTC that is so moving it makes me cry when I hear it. So, and I've given the pitch to a lot of people I run into on why you ought to go down to the Navy, Air Force, Marine, Coast Guard, Army recruiters, put your credentials on the table, find out what's going on. You'll take part in an adventure that will be simply incredible. You'll end up stronger and better and have a better resume and reputation if you go serve a tour in one of the Armed Forces branches. And that includes the National Guard. The men and women in this state and the Washington Air and Army Guard are bulwark in their societies against either crisis or wildfires. So I think consider a career in the military. You'll like it a lot.